We're continuing our study of the armor of God. In just a moment, I'm going to read to you from Ephesians 6, 10 and following, that passage of Scripture. I want to just kind of remind everybody, both for those of you in the room and everybody who's going to be watching this digitally, this has been our schedule. We have started with the armor up and then get strong last time, and then win or lose. And then next week, we're going to talk about armor all. Now, the whole book of Ephesians, of course, is a book written in a very pagan context, and Paul is addressing so much of how to live a Christian life in a pagan world, which is such a relevant thing for us in our world today. Paul will commend and command the Ephesians to be strong in the Lord, to become spiritually strong, and to prepare themselves for the battle, and that's the armor of God. But the questions that we've been talking about through this series are three major questions that kind of focus our attention. And the first is, are you strong in the Lord? So it's a personal question for you to think about in your life. When the apostle says be strong in the Lord, the three things to kind of remember about that is, one is it's a command, it's an imperative mood. The other is that it's in the present tense, meaning it's something we continue to do. The third is that it's passive, which is something that means that we can't do it. We need God to do it. You know, in Isaiah, he'll say that those who wait on the Lord, He will renew their strength, and they will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will not fail. So the strength comes by way of God empowering and strengthening us. You know, there's a similar example of this in Ephesians earlier on when Paul says, be filled with the Spirit, but it's also passive. We can't do it. We need God to fill us, and so it's a passive act in which we submit to Him, and then He works through us and empowers us to do that. All right, then the third question, and it's the one we're going to talk about next week, is do you have on the full armor? So rather than just do you have on a little bit of armor, do you have on the full armor? Now, I don't know if you know a lot about Roman armies, but there were all kinds of different people in a Roman army. Some of them didn't have on armor. Some of them just stood over there on the side and they just flung rocks at people. You know, you don't need armor on if you're going to do that. But if you're going to get at the front of the battle, you better be armored up. And so we're going to talk about that. So, all right, tonight we're talking about, are you winning or are you losing the battle? And that's our question tonight. And I want you to think about that question. Are you winning or losing the battle that you're having with sin, with what we're going to learn tonight, with the enemy in our lives? And so this is our lesson. It's called Win or Lose. And I want to read to you from Ephesians. The verse is really the second half of verse 11, and then it's verse 12. But tonight I'm just going to go ahead and read it all because it's been a while since I read it all. So if you have a Bible, you want to follow along, you can do that. Otherwise, you can just listen to me read. It says in Ephesians 6:10, finally be strong in the Lord and in His mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. And I want you to pay attention to that second part there. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God. And then he goes on to describe that. So what I want us to do tonight is to look at that passage and to think about that question and what all it means. Now, it's kind of interesting. If you look at that passage, he describes different things. You know, he talks about the devil's schemes. He talks about, and he lists out this list of different powers he describes. These and it's kind of hard to understand what he means. They're all sort of grouped together. And then he describes another set. And so there's really kind of three sets of things that he talks about in that passage. And I want us to think about those tonight, and I'll tell you what they are in just a minute. But first, I want us to ask this question when we come to this passage. And we think about this Christian life as a spiritual war. Here's question number one tonight. Who or what is the enemy? Well, we know right away what the enemy's not. What is the enemy not? What does he say? We wrestle not against flesh and blood. So we know the enemy is not a strictly human kind of enemy. And that's really kind of interesting. That's why we call it spiritual warfare, because the battle is not a human thing. Sun Tzu was not a Christian, if you don't know very much about him. He's kind of a famous philosopher and thinker in Asian thought. But he's very well known for a statement, which is that when you're going to battle, the most important thing you need to know is you need to know your enemy. Now, that's not actually what he said. That's part of what he said, but this is what he actually said. He said it is said that if you know your enemies and you know yourself, you will not be imperiled in 100 battles. If you do not know your enemies, but you know yourself, you'll win one and you'll lose one. But if you don't know your enemies, nor know yourself, you'll be imperiled in every single battle. What an incredible, insightful statement, obviously not inspired from God, but a truthful statement of life that we need to know the enemy. So as Paul's describing for us in this passage, he says, listen, you need to know who the enemy is not, and you need to know who the enemy really is. And he groups it into 3 categories. And if I could just simplify them, the enemies would be, first of all, he talks about, in verse 11, the devil. And then he talks about what he calls rulers, authorities, and powers, which in the original language it's really kind of one word with a bunch of words stuck around it. It's cosmokrator. Cosmos means world, and the other is this word for kind of those who run the world, but they run the world we don't see. They run an unseen world, a spiritual world. And then the third are these sort of evil spiritual forces. Now, we're not really sure what Paul means here entirely. We don't know if he has a clear hierarchy, like the devil's on the top, and these guys are sort of his generals, and then these guys are sort of his sort of spiritual demonic minions that are sent out. But it's something along those lines that seems to be in mind. But he's not real clear, but he wants us to know that there is something going on, and we can't see it, but it's real and it's really happening. But he doesn't really dwell on it much. What he really focuses on in the passage is he starts out by saying, be careful of the devil's schemes. So he's not just interested in the enemy, he's interested in the enemy's tactics. He's interested in what the enemy is trying to do. In order to win the spiritual battle, win or lose it, we need to know his tactics. Now, this passage calls those tactics the devil's schemes. I'll just tell you, original language, schemes is the word methods. It has an unfavorable kind of meaning. It can mean scheming. It can mean craftiness. It can mean deceitful scheming. In another passage, in the one right here in 4:14, it's translated as wiles or stratagems. The verb means to defraud, to deceive, or to pervert. In other words, he is up to no good, and he's doing it in a very careful and very methodical, can I say, devilish manner. This is the real stuff he's talking about that we need to be careful of. Earlier in Ephesians, he said, Then we will no longer be infants tossed back and forth by waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching, by the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful scheming. There he's talking about people that are crafty. We've gotten some, how many of you ever gotten a fake phone call that was a little crafty, you know? Give them your credit card number, and we've experienced the craftiness of human beings. But the devil is described to us in this passage as one who is incredibly crafty, an incredible scheme. And his objective is deceitful, and it's intended for that purpose. Now, we don't have time tonight to kind of unpack everything the Bible says about this, but I want to give you a little bit of something to think about tonight. And as it relates to the devil, as we talk about it. It's not very often that you spend much time talking about this, so let me just take a minute and do that. I'll just point to, I'm sorry about the P's there. I'll point to just 2 places in the Old Testament that are really well recognized as being helpful to understand something about the devil. Of course, Genesis 3, Garden of Eden. There he is called the serpent. He's never identified specifically as the devil or Satan. He's just as a crafty. He was more crafty than all the other things that the Lord had made, and he was sort of sneaking around. But if you go back and you read the Genesis 3 account, the words that come out of the serpent's mouth are things like, did God really say? God just doesn't want you to know what he knows. God doesn't really have what's at your best interest of heart. Doesn't that look pretty good? In other words, his intent is deceptive. His intent is scheming. His intent is crafty. His intent is to do the opposite of what we would think that he was trying to do in that moment. Now, the other word that's used in the Bible, and that first category of him is sort of, we'd call him the tempter. The second category, he is called the Satan, Hasatan in Hebrew. It's the accuser. So in one role, he tries to get you to do something you're not supposed to, and then on the other side, he says, so you did it. It's kind of a double play there. Well, this idea of Hasatan, though, again in the Old Testament, it's not really well developed. If you go back and read those verses, you'll never get a sense of the devil as you think of it, because their understanding of all these things was really developing, and we have a lot better understanding of it by the time we get to the New Testament. But in two places there, in Job 2, you have him in the royal heavenly court in the unseen realm. And he comes before God in the royal court, and he says, hey, look at Job, And his job is to sort of stand there and be the prosecuting attorney and point out the faults of Job. Then in Zechariah chapter 3 is the other place, and it's another court scene, and he's a prosecuting attorney, and on trial is the high priest, a guy named Joshua. And he comes in, he's dirty, all of his clothes, his turban, everything is dirty. But God removes all of his filth, all of his dirt, all of his sin. And he's proclaimed innocent. And so now the Hasatan, the accuser, has nothing that he can accuse Joshua of or Israel of. And it becomes a picture of what God is going to do, Zechariah says, in the future, when in a single day he is going to deal with the sins of his people forever. And so it's a picture of what we find in Christ. So that's a little bit of just kind of background in the Old Testament. But when we come to the New Testament and we think about this guy called the devil, there's a few things that are said about him that really stand out. One is in Matthew 4 when he tempts Jesus, and there he is called both the devil and in the same chapter called Satan or Satan. And so the words are actually interchangeable. They have an interchangeable meaning. Satan is a Hebrew word, Hasatan. Diabolos is the Greek version of that, and so they actually are it's really the same word, just used interchangeably, although it has a little bit of a different meaning. But they essentially are describing the same person in the New Testament. So famously, the Satan, the devil, comes to Jesus, and he tempts him. He says, they turn these bricks into bread. Jesus will say, get away from me. And he will leave him. And then they'll say angels attended him. Later in Matthew, we're told that there is a place of eternal fire that has been prepared for the devil and his angels. We'll be told a lot of things about the devil in the New Testament. He steals the word of God in the parable of the sower. Jesus in John 8 will tell us that he's a murderer. He's a father of lies. In John 13, it is Satan that prompts Judas to betray Jesus and fills him in another gospel. In Acts 10, we're told that Jesus' ministry was to free people from the power of the devil. In Ephesians, we're told not to let the devil get a foothold in our lives. In Hebrews 2:14, we're told that he has the power of death. In James 4, we're told to resist him and to submit to God. In 1 John 3:8, we're told that the devil sinned from the very beginning. He's the original sinner. We thought Adam and Eve were, but he predates them. We're told that Jesus came to destroy his work. And in Revelation 12:9, we're told that I can't read my writing, so I don't know. You have to go look it up. What does it say there? And then in Acts chapter 5, it says that, in reference to Ananias and Sapphira, that Satan filled them. Such interesting things. The Bible's filled with the language. I was having lunch with someone today, and I was saying to them, I said, isn't it amazing how we don't use the language the Bible uses about the enemy? We just don't. It sounds creepy and weird to us. But here's some other descriptions. In 2 Corinthians 11, he's called an angel of light. In 1 Peter, he's called a devouring lion. In Revelation 12, he is a red dragon. Now, all these pictures look nothing like that one, which is the one everybody's so familiar with, right? A guy with a fork in his hand and red. Now the red, I guess, the red matches, but the rest of them don't. If we want to be honest about some of the facts of the enemy, because we need to know our enemy if we're going to be dealing with him in our life, then we need to know some things that are just not true. For example, he is not omni. Do you know the omnis? Omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient. He's not omnipotent. He doesn't have all power. He's not omniscient. He doesn't know everything. And he's not omnipresent, which means he's probably not here. Right? He's probably not here. That is a clear indication that we see in Scripture that he's not everywhere, which means we can't say, as that one guy did, the devil made me do it, because he probably didn't make him do it, because he's not everywhere. He is personal, but he's not a person. He can appear in a way very personal to Adam and Eve. He can appear to Jesus in a very personal way, but he's not a person. He wasn't created in the image of God in the beginning. He's not a descendant of Adam and Eve. He's not a person. He is some sort of spiritual entity. He is spiritual, but he's not a wimp. Too often we've heard Christians say things about him, oh, well, he's already been defeated, there's nothing to worry about. But that's not the picture you get in the New Testament. The New Testament gives you a picture that he is a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. Most of us, if we had a roaring lion creeping around the backyard, probably would not think it's a good time to go outside and roast some weenies and make a hamburger, mow the lawn, or something like that. We would call someone for help. He is stalking his prey there in 1 Peter 5:8. In Jude 1, verse 9, it said that when Michael the archangel was contending with him over the body of Moses, that he refused to get into it with him. But he simply said, the Lord rebuke you. Jude says that to say, look, he's not to be trifled with. This enemy is real and powerful and potent. He's not omnipotent or omniscient or omnipresent, but he is real and he is powerful. Now, his most primary tool, though, is his ability to tempt us. And it's interesting that he tempts us and he never tests us. This is the distinguishing characteristic in the Bible about God and Satan. He comes to Adam and Eve in the garden and he tempts them with the fruit. He comes to Jesus in the desert again and again and again, and he comes in Luke 22 to sift the disciples. But there's a distinguishing thing here that Jesus and God in the New Testament never tempt anyone. James 1:13 says, no one should say they've been tempted by God. God doesn't tempt anyone. He's not the author of evil. His purpose is to test our faith, to try our faith, to make it stronger. The enemy's purpose is to do the opposite. The first time years ago I came across this book by M. Scott Peck was when I was an undergraduate and we were studying psychology. And M. Scott Peck was a clinical psychologist. He died a few years ago. He was a best-selling author, but he spent a lot of time working with people who were truly evil in his description, and he wrote a book about it, very vivid incidents that he encountered in his psychiatric practice. The book's been described as disturbing, fascinating, and altogether impossible to put down, which is what you want someone to describe your book as. But it occurs to me as a pastor through the years that I've had a lot of people say to me, I have trouble believing in God, but I have no trouble believing in the devil. It's an interesting thing. When we see the world around us, it's not hard to believe that there's evil. In fact, it's hard to understand why there's so much evil. The other side of this, though, is just the challenge of talking about this topic. It gives us the heebie-jeebies. That's why I am always impressed by C.S. Lewis. You know, he was the atheist, philosopher, became a Christian and a writer. And he's going to write a book. He writes a book about demons, and it's funny and engaging and interesting and whimsical, but it also contains a deep seriousness to it. These are two different covers of his famous book, The Screwtape Letters, in which he imagines that hierarchy we just described in Ephesians, sort of the devil speaking to his underlings, who are speaking to those underlings and training them in all of their deceitful practices to try to get everybody to do all these things that they shouldn't do. Lewis says there are two equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about the devils. One is to believe in their existence, is to disbelieve in their existence. The other is to believe and feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. I want to stop the quote there. I don't want to read the rest of that passage. But basically what he says is there's two extremes. Either someone says, there's nothing to see here. Or, let's spend all of our time thinking about this and talking about it and finding the demon under every rock. Somewhere in the middle, there is a need for us to recognize that. And that's what Paul seems to be dealing in this passage. That's why he says that we're in a struggle. Now, the question is, what is this struggle? And he uses the word pele, which is a wrestling metaphor. And Ephesus was real well known for its wrestling. You know, it's different than WWF. Both Olympia, let me see if I can find my note there. Both Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, and all over Asia Minor, they held wrestling matches. They were popular. People would stand and watch. And I shared with you last time the story of a famous Greek wrestler, of a famous Ephesian wrestler that went to Greece and it was discovered that he had this magical anklet on, and it contained 6 Ephesian grammata, and when it was removed, he lost every battle from then on. And so these people definitely believed in this sort of thing. There's another kind of thing, though, in the Bible when we talk about wrestling. There's a famous story in the Old Testament. It's in Genesis chapter 32, where Jacob is, he's about to encounter his brother. He's been away from Esau for a long time. He's camped at the Jabbok River, the rushing water, and he's going to lay his head down by the rushing water and take a nap. He's all alone. But this text tells us that he gets into a wrestling match with a man, but he's more than a man. And he wrestles with him all night long. Do you remember the story? And the next day he can't walk, and he's crawling around because of what happened during the night. It says in Genesis 32:25, when a man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched, and he was as he wrestled with a man. Now, do you remember what happened next? He didn't let go. Jacob refused. I mean, he had the guy in a position where he was able to defeat him, and the guy was giving up. This is kind of an interesting story. And so he says, I won't release you until you bless me. And so he finally says, all right, I'll bless you. What's your name? He said, my name is Jacob. Now, Jacob means the deceiver, doesn't it? And he says, I'm giving you a new name. You're going to be called Israel. Israel is Hebrew for he who struggles with God. And this was the night of struggling. So sometimes in the Bible, the struggling becomes a very powerful, positive picture. And sometimes in the Bible, it's portrayed here as it is here as one that is with the enemy. Now, the question that we want to ask as we kind of draw this to a close is, who are these rulers, authorities, and powers? And whether we're talking about angels or demons. In Ephesus, they were certainly thought in terms of magical powers. You go read the book of Acts, and they had all these different scrolls and all these different magical thoughts, that if you did this, that, or the other, the powers that existed around you in the unseen realm could control the events of the world. That's where things like luck came from. That's how they believed certain events took place. That's why some ships sank and why some ships did not. That's why you blessed a ship and why you had certain things on it. That's why you wore amulets around your neck. It's why you put things in front of your house and over your house. That was the reason why you carried around your household gods or whatever else, because there was this firm belief that there were all these sort of dark powers in the world. And in the midst of all that, Paul comes along and he starts to talk about one who is over all of that, and one who had complete sovereignty in the world. All through the book of Ephesians, starting in the first chapter all the way through, Paul focuses on this theme. He talks about in the opening prayer that Christ is above all rule and authority, power and dominion, and he is above every name that is invoked. That's because that's how you did magic. You invoked the name of whoever you were doing. Not only in the present age, but he is dominant in the age to come. If we were to go to most parts of the Western world today, most people wouldn't really believe much in this, but if you were to go to Africa today, Joe, you're getting ready probably to go to Africa? Maybe? No? You're not going to go? Dave, you're going to go? All right. Dave, right next to you, Dave McSpadden's he's getting ready to go to Africa. He's getting ready to go to Kenya. He's getting ready to do some work over there. Those people, a lot of them, still believe in lots of this stuff, and it's very much a part of their lives. In Ephesians chapter 2, Sorry, Joe, you were just so close. I just couldn't resist the temptation. Did you catch that? In which you used to live, this is Ephesians chapter 2, when you follow the ways of this world. And listen to the way he describes this. The ways of this world are then compared with, and of the ruler of the kingdom of the air. That's his description of the devil. The spirit that is now at work in those who are disobedient. Part of Paul's understanding is, there's not just some nefarious powers out there, but those powers are very much at work in this world in some nefarious ways. And then in chapter 5, he says, for you were once in darkness. If you're not a Christian, you're in the dark. But now you're in the light, and you should live as children of the light. For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. Find out what pleases the Lord. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. And then a passage in 2 Corinthians, this kind of rounds us out tonight. Paul talks a lot about Satan in the Corinthian letters. Once he talks about him as an angel of light. But in chapter 4, verse 4, he says something truly amazing. He says that the God of this age, and that's how he describes the arch enemy, has blinded the minds of unbelievers. Not their eyes, but their minds. So they cannot see the light of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. Why don't people believe? It's the work of the enemy. Jesus came to destroy the work of this one. Now, I think, and we have 2 minutes to answer this question, what do we do with the devil and evil spirits in today's world? In our Western mindset, we tend to not do much with it. We tend to kind of play it off. And then we pick up the newspaper and we start being confronted with the problem of evil. We read of a 14-year-old who molests and kills a 4-year-old. And we wonder, where does evil like that come from? We read of genocidal attacks. The Germans, the Cambodians, the Serbians, the Rwandans. The list seems to never end. The vicious and vile evilness that exists in our world. And when we look at it, none of us can say that that is anything but just horribly evil. The tendency is to do one of two things. We either try to make this passage all about the human being, their bad upbringing, or something psychologically and physiological about them, and it's all human and physical. Or the other tendency is to say it's all about this demonic thing, and there's a sort of a demon under every rock. But I don't know that either one of those is the right approach. Leonardo Boff in Theology Today a few years ago wrote, evil has never been experienced in a vague and abstract form. When we see evil and we recognize it. But do we recognize that there could be more at work than just the actions that take place in front of us? To answer that question, we have to redefine what we think reality is. And we have to remind ourselves that reality is not just what we see. There is an unseen realm. As we're speaking, there are things happening that we don't see. Gravity is at work. Electricity is at work. You pick up your phone and you talk to somebody. But somehow those signals go through the air as microwaves. We don't see all of that. But it's happening. Our lungs are processing oxygen and turning it into carbon dioxide and all these other kinds of things and the reverse of that. And we see these things. So the question becomes, what is reality? And how do we define it? Is it only what we can see? Or is it possible that there is more to going on to reality than what we can see? And if that's the case, if our real battle is not just a visible one, but an invisible one, it's not just a physical one, but a spiritual one, then we need something. And Paul's the guy who's telling us what it is. And it's called the armor of God. Because without that, how are you going to fight a spiritual battle unless you have the spiritual armor for the battle? And so next time, we're going to talk about how to get the full armor of God. So I'll see you then.